Um, 6th of September 2022. I had a difficult night last night with the old heart failure, so, and I've been busy or, semi-busy or whatever you might call it, trying to do this book about the homestead years. And, and I've kind of realised that I don't have enough time left in my life to finish that book. And that will be organisation and all sorts of other things as well. But the problem is I was pretty well advanced with that book, and I sort of thought it wouldn't take me that much longer, and I'd just keep on doing these essays, and I'd link them all up. That all tell a story. But I kind of realised that in just the last couple of weeks that I actually really do need to put all of that down here on, because I can just talk it into this machine. Get out of bed, make myself a coffee, and sit here and talk it into the machine. And then this morning, then you say, oh, which bit are you going to tell today? Well, I thought I needed to start from the beginning. The problem was that the beginning that I had when I sat down to write it the first time was all about us sort of arriving there on the first day to see the place for the very first time. When we just happened to be going for a drive, basically, Gypsy and I and the Brady's. And we walked in the door of that place. We sort of, it had been in the Women's Weekly. Mum had talked to me about it, and I don't know why, but she had drawn it to my attention. And we'd gone to look at a place in the Wairarapa that Jim and Alison were interested in buying. And we went in my Chev convertible, the big yellow convertible, because, it was a road trip. And the top was down and there were kids in the car and blah, blah, blah. So we went to this first house, which we never went in. Gypsy and I never went in. Jim and Alison went in and they rejected it. And I said, well, since we're this far up, why don't we drive up to Orawara? And I didn't know how to pronounce it then. I didn't pronounce it. And Orawara is the wrong way to pronounce it, of course, but it's what everybody uses. And I was calling it Ora something. And so we sort of agreed that we would do that. And so we set off. Another 2-hour drive up to Takapau, or thereabouts. And so we got there and pulled up outside. The guy hung out the window and asked us what we wanted. We told him we'd come up and see this house. He invited us in. We walked in the sort of foyer area. We looked in that room. We looked in that room without going in. He was not very nice man. And not particularly welcoming. It was almost as though he thought we might be business. So we got into the Bavarian room. We stood there in the Bavarian room alongside a table that was there. And I just said, and I could sort of sense something in his behaviour that said that he was uncomfortable with his situation. I don't know what it was. I said to him, do you want to sell it? And he virtually agreed straight away. He just said, well, yeah, okay, make me an offer. So we went away and we did that and we bought it, and that's another story which I'm not going to tell today. So then we spent 23 bloody years there, 24 altogether, I think. 1970, that was 1976, and we were there until we got evicted by the court in 1999 because the trustees had spent $500,000 to break the lease. Because it's a pretty solid lease, but anyway, if people are determined. And so, breaking the lease probably 5 years before a rollover clause in the lease seemed to me to be a bit bloody gratuitous, really, I suppose. And so I sort of thought that maybe the way I should tell a story is to tell the story of the homestead first. Because my story of the homestead was just one chapter. But, in recent times I got called a squatter by Angus Gordon, who's a farmer / author up there who wrote a book called Historic Homesteads of Hawke's Bay. And a bit about Orawara, he described me as a squatter. And so I didn't know it at the time, but that was picked up by the idiots at Stuff, who of course as journalists are a joke. And then they called me a squatter as well, and then their story was repeated in the Herald and the Don Post. It's a standard of journalism we've come to expect, I suppose. But anyway, so I wrote a sort of bit of palaver, which I put up on which I put up on Facebook. It was a nice, relatively long, probably 4 or 5 page essay about my time at the homestead as a way of rebutting what the Stuff had said, and I sent it to Stuff as well, and with an implied threat. They did nothing. All they did is they just took the squatter comment out of the story. One sentence. And then as a result of my Facebook story, I got a message over the phone, 2 actually. One from somebody up there who explained to me that right in the very early days, even before we got there was a move to try and demolish the homestead. And I had heard that anyway from others, and I think that Kevin Mackay, the lawyer for the trust, had also implied that there was danger of its demolition. So then you go, why would they want to demolish a place like that? And that rumour persisted all the way through till 1999, when we got thrown out, and then the trust actually sold it to pay their legal fees. And the new guy was told that the story the new guy tells, that Peter Harris, who was there until just last Christmas, like 6 months ago, he said that when he came into the deal, that there was a deal on the table with Britons to knock the building down. So then you go, well, I've always wondered why the bloody hell they would want to demolish such a wonderful old building, and also why it came to be like it is. And the like it is that all of the, we bought it from Colin Baxter, who had it 3 years, I think, and that was 1977. And all, you could tell that all the drapes and all those sort of decor items that are fixed, basically, that would have been in the building in the beginning, were gone. And so people told us about this big sale where all of that stuff was sold. So what Colin Baxter had walked into, he had leased it for peppercorn rent, 1 peppercorn a year. And he had to start with curtains, in a huge house. 36 roomed house, and all the drapes in the main rooms were all gone. The lights were gone. The lights in the Bavarian room have been sawn off. Wooden lights in a very bloody, really important, culturally important room because of the work that was done in there, and the lights have been sawn off. So there were a lot of questions about how all that sort of nonsense happened. So then I got a second phone call, which told me something which told me a dark secret from the homestead's past. And that was like December, just before Christmas 2021. And so for me, I've been processing that ever since, that piece of information. And I think that rather than sort of spit it out now, I need to go back and tell the story of the homestead from, let's say, and it's just verbal, and it only take 5 minutes, I suppose, 10 minutes. The house used to be a big box, without that sort of wing on the end, on the southern end. And which contains what we call the Bavarian room, or the ballroom, or the billiard room, depending on who you are or what you are, and a lovely apartment up above it. And the sort of connection between the two, the main part of the house and the Bavarian room are a little bit sort of a little bit not exactly. You can see that they're different buildings. And so, not that that mattered particularly, but anyway, so that was 1900, So there was a big chunk of money put into it in 1900. The original house was built in 1879. So 20 sort of 1 years later, they built this great big extension. So they're doing pretty well, and we're in the early 20th century, and so we they finished doing that building, and we're 14 years away from a world war. And New Zealand, and so coming up to the World War, or once the World War had started, there was a camp, a big army camp there, an army encampment there, while they trained young guys to send them over as bloody cannon fodder to, and it was on Orowara land. Sent them to Gallipoli and Passchendaele and whatever. Thousands, tens of thousands of people died. Young men in a new country. Didn't have them to spare, but they sent as many as they could find, and a lot of people died, and so the homestead, so the home, 1914 to 1918 would have been difficult times, and probably, and that those difficult times would have extended into the 20s, and then in 1923, Christopher Rolleston was born to his mother Agnes Rolleston, whose maiden name, she had inherited the place, and her maiden name would have been Johnson, because Sidney Johnson's her father, and so at that point that estate must have been divided up as well between other siblings, or it might have been one sibling or several. I've not gone and researched that, but I do know that she had at least another sister. So, but Mrs. Rolleston got the main house and 2,500 acres or something. So I call her Mrs. Rolleston, Agnes Rolleston, Nancy Rolleston, as she gets called various things. But she sort of, the way that she's described quite often, she comes across as a bit of a harridan, and I'm not sure whether that's doing her justice, but whatever. But people obviously stepped aside for her and Takapau and Waipakarau. She was well thought of and considered quite powerful. And so she's got this son, born in 1923, Sydney, after Sidney Johnson, Christopher Rolleston, and and he's born in 1923. So they go through the 20s, and the 20s is there was a major global recession in the 20s, which culminated in 1929 in the stock market crash, which was like a global disaster. But mainly in the United States, but nevertheless, so New Zealand paid for that as well. And New Zealand, obviously, they'd had to suffer their way through the recession in the 20s, and then the stock market crash, and then the stock market crash morphed into the bloody depression. Everybody talks about the depression, the depression was a shocking time in New Zealand. There was all kinds of hobos on the road begging for money and trying to get jobs and whatever. And they were in the country and they were in the cities, and it was a bloody financial disaster. So anyway, then Christopher, who's got to be sort of seen as a focal point in this story, he is sent to Sandhurst in 1937 when he's 14. Now, Sandhurst is a military school in Europe. So this is at the end of sort of 6 years of bloody depression, and they know, and the rise of Nazism has taken place from the late 20s on through that, and so the militaristic sort of build-up of Germany is very, very obvious to the whole world, and that must have been Germany's response to the depression, if you like, and so whatever. And so that made them powerful again because, everybody had to do what they're bloody told and whatever. And they're all marching around and goose-stepping and wearing fancy uniforms and all that sort of nonsense. And, that was a whole sort of ideology that got completely out of control. And we know that, and we can look back at it now, and we can sort of see how that would have happened. We're doing the same in New Zealand now, but it's a sort of a Maori one. But anyway, that's another story. And so we're at the early stages of that, and it's going to get nasty here. But anyway, it was getting nasty, and in the mid-30s, it was getting nasty in Europe and very threatening. And so, you know, the Rollistons, Mrs. Rolliston, Mr. and Mrs. Rolliston, they obviously made a decision that their son wasn't going to be cannon fodder like all those poor buggers that had been on, you know, training on the station, ready to go to Gallipoli. So how do you do that? Well, you make sure they're an officer. So they got the money, so they've sent him to Sandhurst. So that would have been a priority over anything they might have done to the house. Now, I know what has been done to the house over time, and, you know, that sort of a lot of it was done in a very slipshod way. And it's, I don't have to prove that to anybody. I mean, I could walk around the fucking house and just point out things that were done long before I ever came along that were basically sort of cost-cutting, you know. And a classic example that even an idiot can see if they want to have a look is the lean-to that runs along the back of the building behind the kitchen. Go and have a look. The roof is all second-hand iron, and it came off the servants' quarters that they'd demolished, you know. And so in the space of those sort of 20 years, some odd things happened in the homestead which changed the configuration of mainly the back of it. And so it wasn't done properly, and, you know, the kitchen was altered as well in a way that wasn't done properly either. And the evidence of that is still there in the butler's pantry, which is sort of is connected to the kitchen. You know, you can look. There's no door between them. You know, the two. It's one big space. And so, walking around it, I can just say, well, you know, you see that there. That thing, oh, right, there's a big place in the ceiling where some of the joinery went up to, and its joinery has been taken down and turned around and put on another wall. But you can see where it's gone from the ceiling. So it makes the place look quite shoddy. And I sort of got, in the court case at the end of the century, I got blamed for some of that. And I know, not specifically, but, you know, they walk around, it looks shoddy, and they go, Dennis Hall must have done this. Well, Dennis Hall didn't. It was all done already. And so off goes, so it's 1938, and off goes Christopher to Sandhurst, and he does the whole, goes through Sandhurst, and the objective is he pops out the end of that as at the very least a lieutenant. And I think they all come out as the lieutenant, and the flash ones get promoted pretty quickly. But when he pops out, it's in the middle of the Second World War. So, you know, life is not going to be like the ordinary guys in the 10 years before who come out as officers and sort of can ponce around in officers' messes and stuff. It's a war. So Christopher's in a war, and he's in and they get him in the Grenadier Guards. They're the people who look after the Queen, you know. Love to know how they did that. But he's in the Grenadier Guards, and he got up to be a major. And, you know, the war was over by the time he was about 24. So, you know, 24, I don't know, I can't do the sums quickly. But the point is that Christopher served very well. He went ashore with, and the Grenadier Guards had set up tank regiments at that time. For some reason, I don't know the reasons behind all that, but, you know, you can find all this on the internet if you want to read it all. I mean, I've read enough of it to tell me. And, you can find Christopher on the Grenadier Guards website. You've got to put in Sydney, Christopher Rolliston, though. So Christopher, he gets in the Grenadier Guards. He's a tank commander. Now, you know, what can that mean? I think a tank commander is the guy with the head sticking out the top. He's not the driver. He's the guy who tells the driver what to do. But, you know, a tank commander, he could have been commanding a group of tanks for all I know. But anyway, they obviously go ashore in that invasion. It wouldn't have been on the first day because that was all bloody infantry, you know. But you know, it would have been on day 2 or 3 or 4 at Normandy. So they've set up that Mulberry Harbour, which was floating sort of caissons that they floated into place to make a harbour so ships could berth on the shoreline, and off they went. And 6th of June, middle of summer. And so then he fought. Then the Grenadier Guards, which includes Christopher, of course, they fight their way through the Battle of Normandy, which was, you know, the Germans were throwing everything at them. And the reason for that is because the Germans wanted, you know, Hitler wanted it stopped at the door, but they didn't succeed, of course. And so then the Grenadier Guards were instrumental in the, if you have a look at the map, you'll sort of see why. All they had to do was go north along the bloody coast, and they went in and they liberated Belgium, and then Brussels, and then carried on into Germany, because of course, Belgium is literally between Germany and the coast. And they go all the way on into Germany to the end of the war. And he survives the war, and he gets the military medal. And so the war ends in, I don't know, and so it ends in 1945, and it's 1947 before he comes back to New Zealand. But it seems that in the meantime, he's met this young woman. Her name's Jennifer. I think her second name is something like Lint. And she comes from Kenya. Her family, and so her family, they're Europeans living in Kenya, like the Europeans living in New Zealand. But I mean, Kenya would have had a higher population of indigenous people. But whatever, I'm pretty sure they were landowners, but who knows? And so so Christopher comes back to New Zealand. He does a job as a roustabout for a little while. God knows why, but then he takes over as a farmer's manager. And so, he had a much more military experience than farming experience, but he takes over as a farm manager. And, Mrs. Rolleston would know plenty about it, so she would still be nominally in charge, if you know what I mean. She's the owner. And so then he takes off and goes to Kenya in 1952. So, but you've got to remember, it takes like 5 or 6 weeks to get there in those days. So late 1951, he's on a ship of some sort, probably going from New Zealand to Cape Town, and then another ship to Mombasa or whatever. Goes to Mombasa, Kenya, marries Jennifer, probably at her home. If they were rural, they would get married at home. And then she gets pregnant. So we're talking January 1952, when they get married. And so then sometime later in 1952, she gives birth to Caroline. And so, and they're back in New Zealand, and they've made it back to New Zealand. And so they're living from what I can gather, they're living in the apartment at the homestead, and Mrs. Rolleston is still dominating and living in the main house. And so, a lot of this has got to be supposition from me, but, it's a reasonable supposition, I suppose, because they were obviously living there. But, I've been told recently that there was a sort of a fair bit of aggravation between Mrs. Rolleston, Nancy Rolleston, and Christopher's wife. And, of course, Christopher's out in the daytime working, and they're living in the same house. And so over time, when in the 20-odd years, 23 years I was there were people who walked through the place, different ones that I allowed to go upstairs. I took them upstairs. Back in that time, I wouldn't let people have the run of the upstairs. If there were people looking at the house, I would go upstairs with them. And so a couple of characters from Takapau said something about there being an iron curtain between the house and the apartment, because the entrance to the apartment was absolutely from upstairs, not downstairs. If you wanted to get from downstairs, you had to go up the staircase that's attached to the south end of the building. So then in 1953, the little baby's only at that time no more than 5 months old. And so, the wife's getting used to living in the homestead. And a woman recently contacted me, and she told me that, and all I can do is hear what people say. I can comment on it or not. But she said there was difficulty between Mrs. Rolleston and the family, Mrs. Rolleston and Christopher's wife, and of course Christopher was busy trying to run the farm, and they said that he was, she said that her father, who knew Christopher, said that he was knocked about emotionally by the war, as were a lot of these guys. A hell of a lot of these people came back from the war damaged. They might not have been physically damaged, but they were bloody damaged up here because they'd seen some appalling things. So in the process of, if you think about him as a tank commander, he would have been in the thick of it. Because, the tanks didn't follow behind everybody. They were at the forefront, They were the people who go blasting their way in. So, that puts you right at the front line all the time because you're a tank commander. And so Christopher Rolliston's war story must have been a horror show. And he would have seen the liberation of some of the concentration camps and death and destruction for, June 1944 all the way through to early 1945. So, it's a year of absolute bloody carnage that he had to live through and be part of it and be sort of, they'd fire their bloody guns off and then drive up there to see what damage they'd done, And so, there's a psychological aspect of that would be quite difficult to take. But anyway, so Christopher comes back and he's a different man to the one that went over, apparently. But you couldn't say he was a man when he went over because he was only 14. But, 14. I was chasing girls when I was 14 and I meant business. So, I don't know. But and I was at work at 15. So So if he was 14 when he went over, he might have been sort of 14 years and 9 months. I don't know. But I think you're maturing very rapidly at that point in your life. I know I was, and so Christopher has had a and then he's getting a serious education in a military school. They don't piss around there. None of this namby-pamby nonsense we do in the bloody 2020s. You did your job, or you're in deep shit. And so. So anyway, he's back in New Zealand. He's got all that behind him, that war and all the rest of it. He seems to be troubled. He's got his wife there living in that house, and she's got a little baby that she's dealing with, and she's still a little baby, not even a year old. So it's serious stuff for her. And she's also having to contend with the fact that the head of the whole household is actually his mother, not Christopher. His mother, and so there was difficulty. There was apparently difficulty between, according to this one woman whose father was a witness to this. She was there was difficulty there that persisted, and she says that Jennifer said, "I can't take this anymore. I'm going back to Kenya," and his response to that was to go out in the yard and shoot himself. So this person who called me said, Christopher Rolliston didn't die in a tractor accident. He committed suicide. But, that was 2021, late 2021, when I found that out. So now you've got this sort of odd situation. I don't want to go too much into that right now. I want to try and explain the history of the homestead rather than just the history of Christopher. So then, Mrs. Rolliston's response to his death is to separate the homestead off from the main block of land and have it subdivided. Subdivided off. So there's a big paddock out the front. There's the homestead block. There's the stables block, and there's the Green Park block. And so they're all combined. And I think it's 45 or 55 acres, something like that. And she isolates all that and puts it in her will, she leaves it to the Catholic Church. So then you have to ask yourself why she would have done that. At the time I thought, why the hell would they give away, their legacy, their sort of their tradition, their family tradition is imbued in that house. And so she gave it away fully furnished, everything, lock, stock and barrel. So the day that she died, which was quite a bit later, 1965. So get the dates right. He died in 1953. So she lived on until 1965. And in that time, she did that subdivision and bequeathed it to the Catholic Church. So in 1965, the Catholic Church comes in and takes it over. Fully equipped. All the chattels, everything. Just comes as a job lot. And it took me a while to piece all this together, but And so they put nuns in there, the Presentation Sisters of Kapiti. Sounds like a relatively newly made up sort of order of nuns, but whatever. And so they took over. I've talked to a couple of these nuns about their time there, and so some of these people are still available. And all you got to do is do the sort of chase them up. I've got their email addresses, but in my email list for people who want to find them. But I've got to decide whether I'm going to tell you or not, whatever. And so the nuns move in, and then inexplicably, you could say, 3 years later, they move out. Gone burger. And so they've got a free house, fully equipped with everything, with enough sort of gardening land and grazing land to be able to sustain themselves easily, all for free. And yet they give it up. They just walk away. And then instead of the Catholic Church saying, oh, well, why don't we put some Marist brothers in there? Because, it's an astonishing asset, really. What they do is they strip it out and hold a big sale. And so all these people come to this great big sale, and the sale is the sort of is a legend, a folklore of the region. And this sale was held, and all of the sort of little goodies and whatever, including the curtains and all the actual house fittings, if you know what I mean, they all get flogged off to the locals, And when I say locals, it'll be people from as far away as Wellington, because emptying out a grand house like that is going to attract buyers from all over the joint. So the Catholic Church flogs everything that they can dismantle from inside the house. And it got so bad that they were talking about getting somebody to come in while all these people were there and cutting balustrades out and selling the balustrades and doors and stuff like this. And people stepped in to stop it, because really it's just turning into vandalism. And that story about stopping that sort of damage is in the folklore. But a friend of mine, for example, there was a balustrade that had been removed some years before that was still stored there. Andrew Livingston, I know him well, and he was a local farmer, and he bought this balustrade that had been removed and a window put in its place. He bought the balustrade and he still uses it as a bed head. So he was there at that sale, and so the place was. So then what have we got? We've got this grand mansion with everything down to the cutlery and knives, the knives and forks and the kitchen equipment and the chandeliers and blah, blah, blah. All gone, all sold, all empty, no curtains, no nothing. And so anybody who wanted to take it over, do something with it, has got to, first of all, contemplate putting a whole lot of that stuff back in. Because, the windows look very, very bare without curtains. So when Colin Baxter came in, so I'm jumping ahead. So that's what it's like. So Kevin Mackay, who's this lawyer, and who told me he was a friend of the family's, not a friend of the family's, he was a family member. He's a lawyer in Waipawa, and so when Mrs. Rolleston died, he was sort of appointed the trustee because they'd set up a trust. So Kevin Mackay is trying to deal with all this, because what happened then, Kevin Mackay is not involved in this at this time because it belongs to the Catholic Church. But what the Catholic Church does then is they give the house back to the trust. Now, I don't know whether money changed hands or not, none of my business, I suppose, but I mean, whatever happened, the trust ended up owning Orawara homestead land and house again, right? And that was about 1970 or 1971. And so Kevin Mackay's got this bloody gutted house that he's got to try and do something with, and he cared about it. I can tell by the way he dealt with me. He worried about the future of that house, and he worried that it was going to get demolished. He told me. He just told me. And so what did he do? He decided that along came Colin Baxter, who said, oh, can I rent that place or whatever? And so Kevin Mackay said, well, you've got to spend a lot of money on it. This is me conjecturising now. Is that a word? So he ends up giving Colin Baxter a 55-year peppercorn lease. So the only money that Baxter's up for is a peppercorn every year. But what he's got to do is put curtains in, and he's got to furnish the bloody place. He's got to put chandeliers in and all that sort of stuff, which he sort of said about doing. But that meant all of his investment money was used to reinstate that building in a way that it could be actually used. So that was 1972. So then I asked myself, why did the Catholic Church leave? I reckon they found out that, I mean, the thing about, I was raised a Catholic. I took a lot of notice of all that stuff when I was young, not because I was a believer, but because I was amazed that adults believed some of that stuff. But, you know, they, as far as they were concerned, if you committed suicide, it was a mortal sin. You go to hell with a mortal sin on your soul. And you couldn't get rid of a mortal sin like that because you're dead. You've killed yourself, you've committed the mortal sin, you're dead, you can't get absolution. And so I reckon the nuns found out that there'd been a suicide on the property. And they went, we're out of here. And once the nuns went, the Catholic Church just had a bloody liability. But, you know, they wanted to, what do? The Catholic Church turned the liability into a sort of a, turn it into cash and just handed the house back. Because, you know, they would have known that once it had been gutted like that, then anybody buying it was up for a big investment and bloody putting everything back in. So Kevin Mackay's got it. He's got to do something with it. He puts a peppercorn lease on it, gives it to Colin Baxter, and he sort of kept an eye on it from there on because he was sort of, to all intents and purposes, administering that. And then we came along in 1977 and bought that. We started the negotiations in 1976, but we bought that off Colin Baxter, that lease. And so, and it cost us $65,000 in 1977. So if you go back, if you get on Google and ask yourself how much you could buy a 3-bedroomed house in Island Bay for in 1977, you'll see that our $65,000 would have bought at least 3 houses. So, you know, it was no small investment on our part. But from the day that we got there, we were not welcome. And Jim and I had gone over, you know, we thought, oh, we need to sort of make ourselves known to the locals. So we went over to see Eric Sanders, who was the then manager of Orowara Station, because, you know, there's the connection. Kevin Mackay administers both, blah, blah, blah. And so, you know, all we wanted to do was please, and we wanted to settle in. And Jim and I were going to, the girls, Gypsy and Alison, were going to run Devonshire Teas and so on, so that we can make a bit of money. And Jim and I were going to rebuild cars because that's what we were capable of. Jim was a first-class mechanic, and I was a halfway reasonable panel beater. So we were just going to buy wrecks, put them together in the, you know, put them back together. And when I say wrecks, I'm talking about cars that have been in a recent accident. You know, buy them from the insurance company and put them back together. You know, it was a way of just generating work in the wop-wops, if you know what I mean. So we go down to Wellington on a trailer, buy some from the insurance companies and cart it back up, bung it back, get the parts, put it all back together again, and paint it and sell it. And it seemed like a reasonably good deal, you know, we could manage all that. So we went over to see, on the sort of first couple of days, we took ourselves over to see the manager of the station, Eric Sanders, over on the corner of Aorangi Road. And his first words to us as he took us into his office on the front of this house were, to be brutally frank, you people don't belong here. I mean, as an opening sort of line, that's astonishingly rude. And so you sort of realise that you sort of, you know, you've come into a community that's not going to be very helpful. And so there was a lot of suspicion about us as well down in the town. Because, you know, people would say, what the hell are they going to do down there? And, you know, Gypsy was a very pretty lady, and so she was, and she dressed like a city slicker. She was a stylish woman, more so than Alison, but, you know, Alison wasn't that bad. It's a terrible thing to say, Dennis. But, you know, we were also driving big American bloody V8s, because I had a 65 Chev, and the other, we'd kept 2 cars, and one of them was my 65 Chev V8 convertible, yellow, and the other one was a Chrysler limo with 360 V8 in it. You know, it was, and so, you know, we stuck out like a sore toe. So, you know, people were suspicious of us, and odd ones came to introduce themselves to us, and we were always welcoming to them. But, you know, we got some very, very strange sort of reactions from people. And, you know, they were rumouring around Takapau that we were going to run a brothel. And, in fact, several farmers, they'll know who they are, if they're still alive, but they're older than me then, so I don't know, came along and wanted to know if they could buy the favours of the ladies. You know, people don't do that unless they've heard that on the grapevine, if you know what I mean. And so we were faced with that as a welcome. And so that coloured our attitude to the locals, I can tell you. And so, you know, we would have to go down to the local. You know, I remember I'd go down to the local supermarket, if you can call it a supermarket, and be buying stuff, and you know, you'd be in the queue, you know. and the thing was that the sort of thing that happened to me probably a dozen times down there was that the lady behind the counter would ask me a question, usually a pointed one, you know. And I can't remember off the top of my head exactly what they were, but some of them were quite intrusive. And so I'm going to try and answer that as honestly as I can, and you know, deflect the sort of really inappropriate ones. And but you know, she was sort of, it was like masqueraded as being friendly, but then the whole bloody queue would join in the conversation. Everybody would be adding bits to it, and I'd be standing there getting grilled. It happened to me at least 6 times, you know. And so in that environment, we're sort of trying to create a name for ourselves as reasonable and straightforward people that we could, you know, and you know, and at the same time we're trying to learn how to run that homestead, you know, mowing the lawns. I mean, Colin Baxter left us with a lot of shit machinery and whatever, and so Jim's spending a lot of his time keeping the bloody mowers going and all that kind of nonsense, and we're learning about the property, learning about the house, mainly the house. I mean, the trees are going to look after themselves, but you've got to look after the house, and you've got to sort of understand that you know, there's what's important in the garden, you know. I mean, the place that had a gardener before wasn't going to have a gardener anymore. What I had to do, and I did it was mostly me that did it. I had to organise the garden so that the work in the garden so that we could eliminate as much as work as we could, because you know, mowing a garden was a far shorter job than trying to turn all the soil over and tend the plants. And the plants were a bit ragged anyway because Baxter never looked after them. So, you know, and I just let the gardens close to the house sort of get overgrown a bit because the big succulents sort of take over, and it all looks normal anyway. And so, and you know, then you're raking drives and you're sort of, and I got friendly with Roddy de Stagpool next door, who owned the farm next door. He was a helpful sort of guy. And there was no water supply. I mean, there was a water supply that sort of meant you could cook and eat and drink and have a bath, but there was no sort of substantial water supply. So I got him to come over and dig a bloody great big hole in one of the lawns around the back, that were alongside the drainage from the hill. And the idea was it would fill up with bloody water, and I could put a dam there out of concrete bricks and things, so that we could store enough water to fight a bloody fire. Because I just used to look at the house and think, fuck, you know, once this place got going, the local fire brigade's going to have no chance of putting it out. So we were always very, very careful about, and you know, there's a fireplace and there's I don't know, 10 fireplaces or something. So you know, you've got to worry about fire. And you just do, and so this sort of what we call the lily pond was right close to the house, and so the fire brigade could just come along and drop a standpipe in there and go pump water into a fire. That was the idea, and so you know, but you know, I often say to people, did you ever come there and find the lawns not mowed? Because you know, we looked after the place, and we've been accused of not looking after the place. And I mean, in the process of the time that I was there, I painted the entire bloody building twice, did it properly. First time supervised by Resine Paints themselves, who provided the paint free, and a Ministry of Works guy appointed by the Historic Places Trust. Because I mean, I'd gone to the Historic Places Trust and said to them, "This is a really important building. You know, we need some help. Financial help would be great, but some advice would go well as well." And so, you know, we were open to all of that. And then, so I'm up to 44 minutes. I want to stop this at 50 minutes. I didn't think I'd go on this long. But so, you know, the other thing that was going on here is that we were having, us four in the house, were having, right from the get-go, were having our own internal difficulties. And they were mainly between me and Alison, Jim's wife. And she wanted, I knew that, it was very clear to me, and we all actually did know, that to be able to sustain this place with Devonshire Teas were one thing, and us, and me and Jim and I getting started with a panel beating business was going to take some time, and we needed to have the guest rooms available. But Alison wanted to use them for her children. And I'm going, no, so she's Jim's wife, and I find myself in a situation where I'm saying, no, you can't use that room. That room's an ensuite room. It's got to be available for guests. And that's what we have to push. And so there were two rooms like that in the main building, the rose room and the blue room, and the red room, which was a bit, but she wanted to, as far as Alison was concerned, no, we're going to live in there. And I'm arguing about that because I'm thinking, even if we had to get one person a week, it's money we desperately need. We paid the power bill. We didn't even know at that point what the power bill was going to be. So, that completely turned to shit in the end. And Alison and I very quickly ended up with an irretrievable situation. We just did. And so Jim can be reasonably wise sometimes. So what he did is he just said one day, look, we're out of here. We're going back up to Napier. Now they initially said that they would sell their house to pay their part of the purchase of the place, but they didn't. They had a house in Wellington, didn't sell it, didn't even rent it out, which is kind of odd. And so we had borrowed their part of the money from Merrick Finance or somewhere. So we had mortgages to the Merrick Finance and to the National Bank because Gypsy and I needed a mortgage for our share as well. So, you can see it gets really complex. And poor old Jim, he's got to try and resettle his wife, it can be quite difficult. Sorry, Alison, but you sort of work quite difficult at times. And so then he's got to resettle his wife and family up and so it's another layer of expense for him. And then he's got to sort of get a job. Well, he's an A-grade mechanic, so you get a job easily, but at the same time, it's getting established with it, which is the tricky bit, and that's going to take some weeks. And so then I'm faced with trying to do this on my own. And in the midst of all this, when this fight was going on in the house, I just thought I can't do this anymore. So I said to Gypsy, I'm out of here. We got to go to Wellington. I got to have a break from this nonsense. And, let them sort it out. And so her and I jumped in the car and went to Wellington. And I don't know, I can't remember where we stayed down there. We stayed somewhere with Joanna, trying to figure out what, Joanna's Gypsy's daughter. And trying to sort of hoping that something might happen. Well, something did. And Jim rang up and he said, I can't do this. I didn't even know where to start. So he said, I'm going to take Alison and the kids and move to Napier, which he did. And it took about 2 or 3 years before we got to the point where we were friends again, if you know what I mean. I think we were always friends. Jim and I have always been good friends because, we just were. But, that sort of trauma causes a big, huge dust up. And so now I have this situation, and I mentioned Christopher's suicide, and this will be the only place where anybody will see that. But so in the 2 minutes I've got left, I've got to say, now what I did was this man had called me and told me that he'd committed suicide. So the first, and it was always said to have died in a tractor accident. So I went to the archives or whatever you have to go to, I don't know, about birth, deaths and marriages, and I got his death certificate. It's easy to do. You just ring up and ask for it and they bloody email it to you. And it said, died of asphyxiation. That didn't fit with, having rolled a tractor over a bank. And I didn't know how big the bank was or whatever, but he was apparently found underneath the tractor, right? So, and so then I thought, geez, I better have a look at there's got to be a coroner's report because it was an accident. Sure enough, there was, and it was no longer available in Hawke's Bay, but I've got it in the archives in Wellington, and I've got it. I've got the death certificate and I've got the coroner's report on my other computer. Oh, it's in my email. So it's on every computer I've got. And so I went through the coroner's report with a fine-tooth comb. And the thing about that is that the coroner's report looks very, very suspect to me. I was gobsmacked at what I read. And maybe I'm going to have to go for another 5 minutes and explain the coroner's report. But, I've done this extensively. I've gone through it detail by detail, by line, and examined what's said. Now, there's 3 statements in the coroner's report, right? And they are from this guy, I think his name's Warren Halford, but his second name's Halford, who's a staff member, right? Now, he tells the whole story about the plane and the tractor going over the bank and the pilot seeing the guy trapped under the tractor from the air and lands his plane in the paddock and comes and tells them, and they go and find the body, and then they call the police and the doctor, And so the person who's made up the story, who's sort of assembled the story, is all in Halford's statement. But interesting, and that was done on the day of the accident. And so also on the same day in the Herald Tribune or one of those in Napier, there's a write-up, a short write-up about a single column like 4 or 5 inches that explains that Christopher had been watching a plane and went over a bank. Nobody witnessed this accident, but they're speculating in the newspapers that he was watching a plane. And so that tells me that, and so apparently there was this top dressing people were there on the scene, and a top dressing pilot had made this thing. So the top dressing pilot must have been working in the area, and so there's a good chance he was staying at the Homestead. So I believe he became part of this bloody conspiracy, and to put that story in the paper on the same day. So, and the other 2 people who make a statement are the policeman and the doctor. So in Halford's statement, he says very, very clearly that when he arrived, he was the first on the scene. Him and the top dressing pilot were the first on the scene of the accident. And he said Christopher was lying on his back. He could see his face, and it wasn't injured. And the weight of the tractor, which was on its side, the rubber wheel on the back, was on his chest. Crystal clear. Couldn't breathe because he had a tractor lying on his chest, and it hadn't necessarily damaged him because it was a rubber wheel. And so Halford must have been a fairly very imaginative guy, and so then and so there are more anomalies in his statement when you read it, right? So it's a sworn statement that made on the day, given to the coroner's report. So the coroner, so 27 days, I think, after the accident, is the coroner's hearing, and the policeman and the doctor both make statements right on that day, quite short statements, but the policeman says he was lying face down, couldn't see his face, and the tractor was on his back. You almost don't need to say anything else about that because the contradiction is complete. And then the policeman makes a statement that sort of says, oh, well, the wheel was close to his head and shoulders or something. And it's very sort of, the policeman's statement is very fuzzy. And so that's all there is in the coroner's report. So you read them and you go, holy shit, there's something wrong here. And why did the coroner not see the glaring differences between the body's position? Because, who's going to forget that? You arrive at the scene of an accident where a guy's dead. The other thing is that this guy Halford, he says I could see he was dead when he got there. And he said, and I estimated that he'd been dead for half an hour. This is a farmhand we're talking about here, and he's making speculations about how long he'd been dead. So, and he could have based that on what the pilot of the plane had said, whatever, I don't know. But, you know, it just seems to me that all that's very, very questionable. So then after that, I had two more calls. One is a person who lives in Takapau, who told me that he had committed suicide. So three altogether, very specific that he committed suicide. And so that explains why all this nonsense that I've just talked about actually happened to the homestead. It explains why Mrs. Rolleston separated it off from and took it away from took it away from the heritage of the family, gave it to the Catholic Church. It explains why the Catholic Church suddenly up and sold everything in it and gave it back. It explains, because it explains why the nuns moved out. And if you look at the sort of rules around, the Catholic attitude to suicide, it explains why they absconded. They didn't want anything to do with, as far as they were concerned, it was a place where sacrilege had been committed. And so the other thing that sort of slides into this somewhat is that the lights were cut out of the wooden lights were cut off the ceiling in the Bavarian room. That's a very famous room, and the sacrilege, the sort of when I say sacrilege, I mean I'm trying to say the idea of defacing a piece of astonishing work like that by sawing the lights off the ceiling is amazing. But you cannot find out how or where they went. And the nuns said they were gone when they got there. I've asked them. In the last 12 months, I've asked them. So you've got an extraordinary situation with the whole deal. And so the reason so did Christopher Rolleston commit suicide? I would say I'd be gobsmacked if he didn't. And it does change the history of it, and it does explain what happened to me, and what happened to me as a result. And so I had already written a thing where I had said my life was completely changed by Christopher Rolleston's death. It doesn't matter whether it was a tractor or a suicide, but my life was completely changed by his death, because without his death I wouldn't have got the homestead. And so yes, it is my business, because I devoted 23 years of my life to it. And am I allowed to talk about it? Absolutely. And so do I want to badmouth Christopher? Well, I don't, because as far as I'm concerned, the guy was a bloody hero. And I think that it's important that his real story is told, because Christopher Rolleston's story, his life story, is encapsulated at the moment in one sentence. Christopher Rolleston died in a tractor accident. Nothing about what he was before, nothing about what he'd already accomplished, nothing about the difficulties that he had faced, none of that sort of stuff, not even discussed, not even mentioned. People don't know. They just don't know. Ask anybody what happened in that place and they'll say Christopher Rolleston died in a tractor accident. Well, I'm telling you the whole story, the true story. Just get it. That's what this is about. And so the reason I'm doing this now is because I'm close to death. I've got terminal heart disease and I don't know how long I'm going to be here, so I've got to do this. And so this thing has got, I thought this would be 30 minutes. It's actually gone on for an hour. And I'm going to have to go back and review it. But I'm not going to, I'm going to stick this on I've got a Facebook page that I've called the Homestead Tenancy, and it's going on there. And it'll be going on there. And all I've got to do is make some sort of arrangement with Facebook to be able to put on an hour-long video, and so I'll do that. So do I have a negative attitude towards Christopher Rolleston? Absolutely not. But I do know that to have accomplished what we've got here, that Mrs. Rolleston, her husband, Mr. Rolleston, Jennifer Lint, his wife, the helicopter pilot, the Tiger Moth pilot, Helford, the policeman, and the doctor. So what are we talking about? Nearly 10 people. They gathered in that house and they agreed to cover up a suicide, and it's a very complex way to do it, but they achieved it for all these years. And that's why I think this man decided, the time that story came out. This is it's 1953, so we're talking what? Talking 70 years ago. It's a 70-year-old secret. time it was told. And it's time that Christopher Rollison is honoured for what he did. And I'm not talking about his suicide, I'm talking about what led up to it. I'm talking about the fact that he went to war. And he was literally sent to war at 14 years old. Because at 1938 he was 14 years old, in 1939 Hitler invaded Poland, and he knew as a little kid, as a young kid, that he was going to be involved in that war. That's Christopher Rollison's story. That's the one that needs to be told. And it might upset some family members, but you know, you're just going to have to suck it up, because Christopher Rollison deserves recognition for his truth. If you've watched this to here, you're amazing. Thank you very much.